In the harsh winter of 1884, deep in Wyoming territory, where the wind came howling down from the mountains with nothing to stop it, a man named Thomas Morgan built a cabin that made his neighbors laugh. The settlement of Independence Rock sat scattered across the high plains, with homesteads spread far enough apart that visiting meant half a day's ride. Thomas had arrived 2 years prior from Pennsylvania, a carpenter by trade who'd lost his wife to fever and decided to start fresh where the land was cheap and the sky was wide. He'd spent his first winter in a dugout carved into a hillside, watching ice form on the inside walls, while he burned through cords of firewood just to keep from freezing. That experience taught him something the old-timers around Independence Rock didn't seem to understand. They all built their cabins the same way their fathers had, the way everyone back east did it. 4 walls of chinked logs standing straight up, a pitched roof to shed snow, a single door, and maybe a window if you had glass to spare. Every winter, they'd huddle close to their hearths, feeding log after log into the flames, watching their precious wood piles shrink while the cold crept through every gap in the chinking. Thomas watched them struggle, watched them complain, and he watched something else, too. He noticed how snow would pile up against the north walls of cabins, how it would actually seem to help keep the wind out. He remembered the root cellars back in Pennsylvania, how they stayed cool in summer and relatively warm in winter, protected by earth on all sides. He thought about how the natives in the region built their winter lodges, low to the ground with earth bermed up around them, and he started wondering if maybe everyone was building their cabins wrong. When Thomas tried to explain his idea to his nearest neighbor, a grizzled homesteader named William Fletcher, who lived 3 miles east, the man looked at him like he'd gone simple. Thomas wanted to build a cabin with a roof that swept down nearly to the ground on 3 sides, leaving only the south face open with a proper wall and door. He planned to pile earth up against those extended eaves, creating what he called a protective blanket around the living space. Fletcher shook his head and told him he was fixing to waste good timber on foolishness. At the settlement store, where men gathered on Saturdays to trade news and supplies, word of Thomas's plan spread quickly. Old Samuel Wright, who'd been in the territory since before it had a name, said it outright. "Boy's gonna build himself a fancy tomb," he declared, tobacco juice dark in the corner of his mouth. "Might as well dig another dugout and be done with it." Others agreed. Why would you want a roof coming down to the ground? How would you stand up inside? Where would the smoke go? And all that earth piled up, it would just make the whole thing damp and miserable. Thomas tried to explain about insulation, about how the earth would hold warmth the way it held coolness in a root cellar, but they weren't hearing it. They saw a man wasting resources and effort on something that went against every bit of common sense they knew. The ridicule stung, but Thomas had spent a winter with ice on his walls, and he'd spent nearly all his firewood doing it. He decided to trust what he'd observed, more than what tradition said should be true. In the spring of 1884, as soon as the ground thawed enough to work, Thomas started gathering materials. He needed more timber than a normal cabin would take. That much was certain. He rode up into the foothills where pine grew thick, spent weeks marking and felling trees. Not the big old giants, but younger ones with trunks about as thick as a man's torso, straight and clean. He figured on near 40 trees all told, maybe more. He hauled them back to his claim 4 or 5 at a time, his wagon creaking under the weight, the mules straining in the traces. The wood needed to be relatively fresh, not fully seasoned, because he needed it pliable enough to work with, but strong enough to bear weight. He cut the logs to length, stripped the bark, and began notching them the way his father had taught him back in Pennsylvania. The foundation he dug deeper than normal, Wanting the floor below the frost line, he laid in stone for drainage. Working in a mix of sand and gravel, he hauled from the creek bed 1/2 mile south. The floor joists he set heavy and close together, knowing they'd bear not just the weight of living, but the weight of earth he planned to pile around the structure. The basic frame went up over the course of several weeks. Thomas worked mostly alone, though a couple of the younger settlers came by out of curiosity and stayed to help hoist the ridge beam. The cabin measured about 12 feet on each side inside. Not large, but workable for a single man. What made people stop and stare was the roof. Instead of pitching it steep and stopping at the walls, Thomas extended the rafters down and down until they nearly touched the ground on the north, east and west sides. On the south, where the door and a single small window would face the winter sun, he built a proper wall, 8 feet high. But those other 3 sides, the roof came sweeping down like a great wing folded around the cabin. He covered it all with split shakes made from the straightest pine, overlapping them careful to shed water. Then he added a layer of bark strips, then another layer of shakes. He was building thickness, building layers, the way you'd wear a coat over a shirt, over an undershirt on the coldest days. Inside, the space felt strange at first. The ceiling was high enough to stand in the center, near 8 feet at the peak, but it sloped down on 3 sides until you couldn't stand within a few feet of those walls. Thomas built a sleeping platform along one of those low walls, utilizing the space that would otherwise go unused. He constructed his hearth in the center of the south wall, with a stone chimney that drew straight up and out through the roof. He made the door thick, double-layered with sawdust packed between the boards. The single window he fitted with real glass, a luxury he'd saved for, but he made shutters for it that could be closed tight and sealed. Every seam, every joint he packed with a mixture of clay and grass, then covered it with thin strips of wood. He was thinking about air, about how it moved, about how to keep the cold air out and the warm air in. His neighbors, when they rode by to see the progress, shook their heads and made jokes. "Building a bear den, Thomas," one called out. Another said it looked like something that would cave in come the first heavy snow. Thomas just kept working. By late summer, the cabin stood complete except for the final element that would make the whole thing work. Thomas had been hauling dirt, load after load after load. He'd cut sod from his own land in thick strips, stacked it like cordwood to dry. Now he began piling earth against those extended eaves, working his way around the north, east, and west sides. He started at the base where the roof met the ground, packing the dirt tight against the shakes. He layered in the sod, grass side out, building up and up until the earth reached halfway up those sloping sides. It took him the better part of 3 weeks, working dawn to dusk, his back aching and his hands raw. He shaped the earth so it would shed water, forming gentle slopes that would keep rain and snowmelt running away from the structure. When he finally stepped back to look at what he'd done, it looked less like a cabin and more like a small hill with a door in one side. His neighbors thought it looked absurd. Samuel Wright rode out specially to see the finished product and sat on his horse for a long moment before speaking. "Well," he said finally, "I've seen some damn fool things in my time, but this might take the prize. You'll be cold and damp and regretting this come December. Mark my words." But Thomas wasn't worried. He moved his few belongings in as autumn painted the aspens gold. He spent those first cool nights testing how the cabin held heat, and what he found made him smile despite himself. In the evening, he'd build up the fire to cook his supper and warm the space. When he let the fire die down to coals for the night, the warmth stayed. He'd wake in the morning and the cabin would still be comfortable, just from the heat held in the stones of the hearth and the earth surrounding him. He started keeping track, in his own way, of how much wood he was using. Maybe 5 or 6 good logs a day, burning slow and steady. He thought back to the previous winter in his dugout, where he'd burned near 3 times that much, and still watched his breath fog in the dim light. He tried explaining this to William Fletcher when the man stopped by in October. Fletcher allowed that the cabin did seem warmer than expected, but maintained that the real test would come when the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there. "Any fool can keep warm in October," Fletcher said. "Let's see how you do in January." The cabin worked the way Thomas had hoped, because of something he'd understood instinctively from his observations. The earth piled against the sides acted like a heavy coat wrapped around the living space. Just as you'd wear layers in winter, the cabin had layers. The logs formed the first barrier, then the air space under the extended roof, then the thick covering of earth and sod. That earth, once it settled and packed down, held a steady temperature. It didn't warm up much in the day, and it didn't cool down much at night. It was like banking coals in a stove, keeping things at an even level rather than swinging high and low. The heat from the hearth would soak into the log walls and the earth surrounding them, storing there like water in a rain barrel, then slowly releasing back into the living space over the course of hours. Meanwhile, the cold wind that tore across the plains would hit those earth-covered slopes and slide right over, like water flowing over a river stone. There were no flat walls for the wind to hammer against, no vertical surfaces to steal heat. The extended roof meant that even snow, when it piled up, became just another layer of insulation, rather than a problem to be cleared. The south-facing door and window caught what winter sun was available, letting that free heat into the space during the day. Thomas hadn't studied any engineering books or consulted any scholars. He'd just watched how nature kept things warm, how animals burrowed deep, how Earth stayed a constant temperature below the surface, and he'd tried to build a cabin that worked with those principles rather than against them. By November, the morning frost came hard and regular. Thomas settled into the rhythm of winter life, finding he could let his fire burn low during the day when he was out checking his trapline or tending to his livestock. The cabin would still be comfortable when he returned. His woodpile, which he'd stacked near the door, wasn't shrinking the way he'd seen other men's piles diminish. He was using perhaps a third of what he'd burned the previous year, maybe even less. When he saw his neighbours in passing, they'd ask how he was faring in his peculiar dwelling. He'd tell them it was working better than expected, but he could see they didn't believe him. They figured he was just too proud to admit he'd made a mistake. Old Samuel Wright said as much at the settlement store. "Man built himself a hole in the ground with a fancy door," he declared, probably sitting in there damp and cold, but too stubborn to say so. The other men chuckled and agreed. Nobody was about to try copying Thomas Morgan's fool cabin. That was certain. Then December came in like a wolf, all teeth and fury. The first real storm swept down from the north, bringing temperatures that made the old-timers shake their heads and prepare for a hard winter. The wind screamed across the plains for 3 days straight, piling snow in drifts higher than a man's head. Thomas stayed in his cabin, keeping the fire burning steady but not large, reading by candlelight and working on the mink pelts he'd taken from his trapline. The wind roared over his earth-covered roof like a living thing, but inside the temperature stayed even and comfortable. He wore just his regular clothes, no need for a coat indoors. The walls didn't frost over, the floor stayed dry. He used maybe 6 logs a day, letting them burn slow and complete. 3 miles east, William Fletcher was burning through his woodpile at an alarming rate. He'd wake in the night to feed the fire, keeping the flames high, but still the cold crept in through gaps in the chinking. His children slept close to the hearth, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Fletcher's wife had taken to hanging blankets across the walls on the north side, trying to create dead airspace between the fabric and the logs. It helped some, but not enough. Each morning brought a dusting of frost on the inside walls, where their breath had frozen overnight. 5 miles south, Samuel Wright was faring no better. His cabin was tight by frontier standards, well built and properly chinked, but the cold was relentless, and the wood was disappearing faster than he'd calculated. He'd spent a full day splitting and stacking, only to watch that pile vanish in less than a week. His wife complained that she could never get warm, that even sitting right by the fire, she felt the cold at her back. The storm that swept in just after Christmas of 1884 was one that people would talk about for years afterward. The temperature dropped and kept dropping, until breathing hurt and any exposed skin went numb in minutes. It was the kind of cold that killed cattle in the field, that froze chickens solid in their roosts. The wind drove the cold through every crack and crevice, and the snow came down so thick you couldn't see your own hand at arm's length. The storm lasted 5 days, and by the 3rd day, William Fletcher was desperate. His woodpile was nearly gone. His children were frightened by how cold it was, even right next to the fire. His wife had started talking about moving back east, about how this land was too harsh, too brutal. Fletcher knew that Thomas Morgan's place was only 3 miles north, but 3 miles might as well have been 300 in weather like this. Still, on the 4th day, when the wind died down enough to see, he bundled himself in every layer he owned, saddled his horse, and rode north. He figured if Thomas was still alive in that strange dwelling, maybe the man would share some firewood. Fletcher almost rode past Thomas's cabin, because the snow had drifted over the earth-covered sides until it looked like just another hill in the landscape. Only the dark rectangle of the door gave it away. He tied his horse to the hitching post, surprised to see it clear of snow, and knocked on the thick door. Thomas opened it immediately, and Fletcher felt a wave of warmth wash over him. Inside the cabin, Thomas stood in his shirt-sleeves. No coat, no hat. A modest fire burned in the hearth, flames dancing low and steady. The interior was warm enough that Fletcher immediately started sweating under all his layers. He stood there in the doorway, snow falling from his clothes, and tried to understand what he was seeing. How, he finally managed. How is it this warm in here? Thomas invited him in, shut the door behind him, and explained while Fletcher stripped off his outer layers, just to be comfortable. The logs burning in the hearth were thick, but not plentiful. 3, maybe 4 pieces, burning slow. Thomas said he fed the fire twice a day, morning and evening, sometimes adding a log or 2 during the day if he was around. That was it. The cabin stayed warm all through the day and night, never getting cold enough to need urgent attention. Fletcher walked around the small interior, touching the walls. They were dry and slightly warm to the touch. No frost, no ice, no dampness. The floor was comfortable enough to walk on in stocking feet. The air was close but not smoky, the chimney drawing well enough to keep the space clear. Thomas showed him the sleeping platform, explained how he'd built the door, walked him through the whole design. But more than the explanation, it was the simple physical reality that convinced Fletcher. Here was a cabin in the worst storm anyone could remember, staying warm with less fire than most men needed just for cooking. Fletcher thought about his own family huddled against the hearth, thought about his dwindling woodpile, and felt something like despair mixed with awe. "I called you a fool," he said quietly. "We all did." Thomas just shrugged. "Reckon I can't blame you for that. It looks strange enough. But I spent a winter freezing, and I decided to try something different. Seems to have worked out." Fletcher stayed for maybe an hour, warming himself thoroughly before heading back home. The ride back through the snow and wind felt even more brutal after experiencing the comfort of Thomas's cabin. By the time he reached his own place, he'd already started planning how he might modify his cabin, or perhaps build a new one come spring. The storm finally broke on the 6th day, leaving the landscape buried under snow that would take weeks to fully melt. When people finally ventured out to check on neighbours, word spread quickly about Thomas Morgan's cabin. Fletcher told everyone who would listen about how warm it had been, about how little firewood Thomas was using. Samuel Wright rode out to see for himself. Still sceptical, Thomas welcomed him in, showed him around, let him feel the warmth and see the modest fire. Wright stood in the centre of the cabin for a long moment, looking up at the sloped ceiling, then at the comfortable living space, then back at Thomas. "I'll be damned," he said finally. "I'll be double damned. This thing actually works." Thomas allowed that it seemed to. Wright asked questions, practical ones now, about how deep the earth was piled, how the roof was structured, whether it might work on a larger scale. He admitted, with the kind of grudging honesty that characterized frontier men, that he'd been wrong. "Thought you were building foolishness," he said. "Turns out you were thinking smarter than the rest of us. My wife would appreciate a cabin like this, I expect. Might need to talk to you about helping me build one come spring." That conversation was the first of many. Over the remainder of that brutal winter, men came from across the scattered settlement to look at Thomas's cabin and ask questions. Some were neighbours, others were newcomers he'd never met, drawn by stories of a cabin that stayed warm with almost no firewood. Thomas explained the design to anyone who asked, never charging for the information, never acting superior about it. He just described what he'd done and why he'd thought it might work. By the time spring thaw came, in March of 1885, 4 men had already started gathering timber to build cabins of their own using Thomas's design. William Fletcher was the first to complete one, working through the summer with Thomas's help. When the next winter came, Fletcher's new cabin performed just as well as Thomas's had. His wife declared it the warmest winter she'd had since leaving Iowa, and their woodpile lasted twice as long as it ever had before. Over the next 5 years, the design spread throughout the Independence Rock settlement and beyond. Travellers passing through would see these strange, half-buried cabins and stop to ask about them. The explanation would come with proof, as anyone who stepped inside on a cold day could immediately feel the difference. The technique became known locally as Morgan building, though Thomas himself never tried to claim any special credit. He'd just noticed something, tried something, and it had worked. Other men adapted the design to their own needs. Some built larger versions for families, extending the basic principle to cover more living space. A few experimented with having the earth-covered sides on just 2 walls instead of 3, or adding a second south-facing wall for more light. The core idea remained consistent, though. Extended eaves, earth piled deep for insulation, letting the ground's natural temperature work for you instead of against you. Thomas lived in his original cabin for near 15 years, before building a larger house for the wife he eventually married and the children they had. The cabin remained standing for another decade after that, serving as a storage building and workshop. Even when it was finally dismantled, the basic structure was sound, the logs still solid, the design still functional. Settlers who moved into the area in later years would see ruins of these earth-covered cabins and wonder at their purpose. Old-timers would tell the story of Thomas Morgan and his peculiar dwelling, how everyone had laughed at him right up until the winter proved him right. The technique never became universal. Traditional building methods held strong appeal, and material was easier to come by as the railroad arrived and lumber could be shipped in. But in that particular corner of Wyoming Territory, among those who'd lived through the winter of 1884, the memory of Thomas's innovation remained strong. What Thomas Morgan did was something humans have been doing since we first left the caves and started building shelter. He looked at a problem everyone accepted as inevitable: the brutal cold of frontier winters and the constant battle to stay warm, and he questioned whether it had to be that way. He didn't rely on what everyone else did or what tradition said was proper. He watched nature, observed how the earth itself stayed a constant temperature, noticed how snow could insulate rather than just accumulate. He took those observations and applied them with the materials and skills he had available. His neighbors thought him foolish because what he proposed went against their understanding of how things should be done. But Thomas trusted what he'd seen and experienced more than he trusted convention. That takes a particular kind of courage, especially when you're alone in the decision, and people you respect are telling you you're wrong. The winter storm that validated his design wasn't created to prove a point. It simply revealed what was already true. Efficiency isn't always obvious. Sometimes what looks strange or complicated is actually simpler and more effective than what we've always done. The settlers of Independence Rock learned something important that winter. They learned that survival on the frontier meant more than just endurance and hard work, though both were essential. It also required observation, creativity, and the willingness to try new approaches, even when those approaches seemed unlikely to work. Thomas Morgan's cabin stayed 26 degrees warmer than conventional structures during the worst cold because he'd thought carefully about how heat and cold actually worked, about how to trap warmth and deflect wind, about using the earth as an ally rather than just a foundation. He didn't have modern understanding of thermodynamics or insulation values. He just had common sense and keen observation. That was enough. The technique he pioneered was, in many ways, rediscovered independently in later years when people started building earth-sheltered homes and talking about passive solar design. The principles remain the same whether you're a frontier carpenter in 1884 or an architect in the present day. Work with nature rather than against it. Use mass to store heat, minimize exposure to wind, capture available sunlight, and build in layers. These stories from the frontier matter not because they're quaint historical curiosities, but because they remind us of something essential about human ingenuity and adaptation. Men and women who settled the American West weren't superhuman. They were just ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges with limited resources. They solved problems because they had to, and sometimes their solutions were brilliant in their simplicity. Thomas Morgan's earth-covered cabin represents countless similar innovations that happened across the frontier. Practical knowledge born from necessity and refined through experience. Most of those innovations were never written down, never celebrated, simply passed from neighbor to neighbor, and eventually forgotten as conditions changed and new technologies emerged. But they were real, they worked, and they kept people alive in conditions that would have killed them otherwise. That deserves to be remembered and honored. If you found value in this story, if it's made you think differently about problem solving, or appreciate the practical wisdom of those who came before us, consider subscribing to this channel and letting us know in the comments. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, techniques and innovations from the frontier that reveal something true about human creativity and resilience. By engaging with this content, you're helping preserve that knowledge and keep those memories alive. Share your own stories if you have them, tales from your own family history or region about people who thought differently and solved impossible problems with what they had at hand. We're building a community here of people who appreciate practical wisdom and frontier ingenuity. Your participation matters to that effort. The earth-covered cabin Thomas Morgan built in Wyoming Territory in 1884 stood as a testament to the power of observation and the courage to think differently. In a land that demanded innovation just to survive, he provided exactly that. His neighbors learned, through the undeniable proof of a brutal winter, that sometimes the foolish-looking idea is actually the wisest approach. Sometimes the man working alone, trusting his own eyes and reason, sees more clearly than the crowd following tradition. That lesson echoes across time, as relevant now as it was then. A reminder that progress often begins with someone willing to be called a fool.